Most people think they have a people problem. They'll say, it's my boss, it's my partner, it's my friend. But what they're really dealing with is a pattern problem. And until you learn to recognize patterns, you will keep changing people without ever changing your experience. Because toxic behavior is rarely random. It's consistent, it's repetitive, and more importantly, it's predictable. What confuses people is that toxicity doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it sounds like advice. Sometimes it even feels like love. But when you step back and observe, not emotionally, but objectively, you begin to notice something. The same conversations lead to the same outcomes. The same person leaves you feeling the same way. Drained, questioning yourself, slightly smaller than you were before. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns tell the truth that personalities try to hide. A person can be charming and still be toxic. They can be intelligent, successful, even kind in moments, and still operate in a way that slowly erodes your clarity and confidence. If you focus only on who they are, you'll constantly feel conflicted. But when you focus on what they do repeatedly, the confusion starts to disappear. Because behavior doesn't lie. Patterns don't lie. Think about it this way: one negative comment can be dismissed. Two can be explained. But when it becomes a cycle, when criticism is constant, when accountability is avoided, when every situation somehow turns back on you, that's no longer a bad day. That's a behavioral signature. And every toxic type has one. The critic doesn't just point things out, they consistently make you feel inadequate. The manipulator doesn't just persuade, they subtly distort reality until you start doubting your own perception. The victim doesn't just share pain, they position themselves in a way where you become responsible for fixing it over and over again. These are not isolated incidents. These are strategies, conscious or unconscious, that repeat because they work. And here's where it becomes even more important. If you don't recognize the pattern, you personalize the behavior. You start asking, what did I do wrong? Why does this keep happening to me? How do I fix this person? But the better question is, why does this pattern keep repeating? And why am I still engaging with it? And awareness changes everything. When you see the pattern, you stop chasing explanations. You stop needing closure from someone who benefits from keeping you confused. You stop expecting a different outcome from the same behavior. And that's where your power begins to return. Because recognition creates distance. Not necessarily physical distance at first, but psychological distance. You start to observe instead of absorb. You start to listen without immediately reacting. You begin to separate their behavior from your identity. That's a critical shift, because toxic patterns rely on your emotional participation. They need your reaction, your justification, your effort to fix, explain, or prove something. Without that, the pattern weakens. But you can't disengage from something you haven't clearly identified. That's why this matters so much. You're not just learning to label people. You're learning to decode behavior. You're learning to see what's actually happening beneath the surface of conversation. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing how quickly certain people deflect responsibility, how often they reframe situations to protect themselves, how consistently they create emotional imbalance in the room. And instead of feeling confused, you'll feel clear. Not emotional, not reactive. Just clear. And clarity is what protects you. Because when you're clear, you stop negotiating with patterns that have already revealed themselves. You stop giving second chances to behavior that has never once changed. You stop investing energy where there's no evidence of growth. You don't need more time. You don't need more conversations. You need better recognition. Because the moment you stop asking, who are they really? And start asking, what do they consistently do? You step out of confusion and into control. And that's the shift most people never make. So as you move forward, don't just listen to what people say. Don't even focus solely on how they make you feel in a single moment. Watch what repeats. Watch what stays consistent over time. Because in the end, people will tell you who they are, but patterns will prove it. And once something is proven, the only question left is whether you're willing to keep ignoring it or finally act on what you see. Once you begin to recognize the patterns, something else starts to become clear. And this is where the conversation shifts from observation to responsibility. Because toxic behavior doesn't just exist in isolation. It connects, it attaches. And it attaches to something very specific within you. Every toxic type survives by feeding on a psychological opening. Not a flaw in the sense of weakness, but an unguarded strength. Your empathy, your patience, your willingness to understand, your desire to keep the peace, these are not negative traits. In fact, they're the very qualities that make you a good friend, a reliable partner, a thoughtful human being. But in the presence of the wrong pattern, those same qualities become access points. And that's the part most people struggle to accept. Because it's easier to label someone else as the problem than to ask a more uncomfortable question: what is this behavior feeding on in me? The critic, for example, doesn't just speak. They measure, they evaluate, and they keep doing it because somewhere at some level, you're still trying to prove them wrong or win their approval. Not consciously maybe, but subtly. You respond, you explain, you adjust, and every time you do, the dynamic continues. The manipulator operates differently. They don't confront directly. They shift reality. They rely on your self-doubt, your tendency to second-guess yourself. They introduce just enough confusion to make you question your own interpretation. And once that doubt is in place, they don't need control. They already have influence. Then there's the victim. On the surface, they appear harmless, even deserving of compassion. But over time, you notice a pattern. The story never changes, only the details do. There's always a problem, always a struggle, always something that places them at the center of difficulty. And if you're someone who naturally wants to help, to support, to fix, you become the perfect audience. Not because you're weak, but because you care. And that care becomes the resource. What ties all of this together is not the behavior itself. It's the interaction between their pattern and your response. Toxicity is rarely sustained by one person alone. It's maintained through a dynamic, a loop. They act, you react. They push, you accommodate. They withdraw, you pursue. And over time, that loop becomes normalized. You stop questioning it, you start adapting to it. And adaptation in the wrong context becomes self-abandonment. That's the deeper psychological cost. Not just dealing with difficult people, but slowly losing clarity about your own boundaries, your own standards, your own sense of what's acceptable. Because when a behavior is repeated often enough, especially in close relationships, it starts to feel familiar. And familiarity can be mistaken for normal, but normal does not mean healthy. So the real work here is not just identifying toxic types, it's identifying your points of entry. Where do you overextend? Where do you tolerate longer than you should? Where do you give the benefit of the doubt, even when the evidence no longer supports it? This is not about blame. It's about awareness. Because once you understand what your natural tendencies are, you can begin to protect them instead of exposing them. Your empathy doesn't have to disappear, but it does need direction. Your patience doesn't need to shrink, but it does need limits. Strength without boundaries becomes vulnerability, and toxic patterns are drawn to unbounded strength. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts internally. You stop seeing yourself as someone who keeps encountering the wrong people, and you start recognizing the dynamics you've been participating in, often unconsciously. And that recognition gives you leverage. Because now, instead of trying to change someone else's behavior, you start adjusting your own responses. You pause before engaging. You question the impulse to fix. You become more selective with your attention, your energy, your emotional investment. You don't harden. You become precise. And precision changes everything. Because the moment a toxic pattern no longer finds what it feeds on, it either adapts or it disappears. Either way, it loses its hold. That's the shift most people miss. They think the solution is confrontation or explanation or finding